Perhaps the greatest of the apologists is a man named Justin. He becomes known as Justin Martyr because he dies, not because his parents named him that. That would be a poor name for a kid. So Justin was born somewhere around 72 or so. No, not 72. I thought I had a list, but I don't. He's born somewhere towards the beginning of that first century. Appears to have been a Samaritan, but kind of displaced himself from Samaritan culture. Right? He's not. I mean, he recognizes he's a Samaritan, but he also refers to himself as a Gentile. Claims he was uncircumcised. At some point, he becomes interested in philosophy. Right? Now, Justin is presenting this in the context of writing to the emperor, trying to appeal to him to, respect Christians, recognize they're not a threat to the empire. So maybe he might be embellishing some of his background. But what appears to be the case, according to what he says, is that he tries various schools of philosophy. Right? He presents himself as kind of being interested in God, about spiritual things, about reality, and he moves through a variety of schools. He becomes a peripatetic, follows peripatetic, of course, this teacher that walks around, hence they were called peripatetics. And there's a Greek word for that. He doesn't really care for that guy. He becomes a Pythagorean. That doesn't really work out as well. He will also try Platonism. So he kind of moves, I think he was also a Stoic at one point too, right? So he kind of moves through these philosophical schools. But often he finds, especially the teachers of these things, lacking. Right? And so it's kind of the teacher just doesn't have the answers he wants. Eventually he comes across, at least the way he tells it, comes across an old man. And so they strike up a conversation about philosophy, about God. And eventually the old man persuades Justin to consider Christianity. And Justin would claim that what he was lacking in philosophy, right, that all this searching around, he couldn't find the answers he was wanting, here it was in Christianity. And specifically, it was the old man's way of life that was the philosophy for Justin. And it was the only sure and useful philosophy. He was living what he was talking about. After his conversion, there's not much known about his life except he starts writing. There are 3 documents that many scholars believe are written by Justin. There are other documents that have had Justin's name attached to them, but they're believed to not be, that they're not legitimate documents. They've been, they were not Justin's documents. The first apology, written to Antoninus Pius, the emperor at the time, the emperor before Marcus Aurelius, although Marcus Aurelius is also addressed in the letter as well. And it's kind of, Antoninus Pius is the emperor, but Aurelius is also well known at the time before he becomes emperor. In this document, the focus is kind of laying out not only why Christianity should be respected and how the philosophers, demonstrated a lot of the teachings that Christianity has. I mean, he tries to make, in the first apology, he tries to make the philosophers Christians before Christ. Right? That they were pointing towards Christianity. Right? And they had Christian ideas, even though they're 300 years before Christ lived. But also, apology is useful because the last part of it is a laying out of a Christian assembly what takes place, what happens on the first day of the week. And so that provides us with some good information about what were Christians doing during that time. So not only does it give us some philosophical things, it provides us with an interesting look into the Christian life. The second apology, there's a question whether this is actually a separate document or whether it was written as part of another document. It just, the manuscripts that exist just kind of start off. There's not an introduction that's there, but very similar to the first as far as the goal. The dialogue with Trypho is a discussion Justin has with a Jew named Trypho. Again, scholars question whether there was actually a Jew named Trypho or whether Justin has created this fictional dialogue. But essentially this is a focus on Judaism and Christianity. Right? So instead of Christianity and philosophy, it's more focused on Christianity and Judaism. At some point later in his life, Justin is accused of being a Christian. It's claimed that a philosopher gets upset because he's bested by Justin in a debate or a conversation, and so he's accused by this philosopher. Dies somewhere around the year 165. Let's make a comparison to kind of sum up this during this time. I want to make a comparison here between some of the attacks and some of the responses, and particularly thinking about the pagan ones, but we'll talk about some of the Jewish attacks at this time. What were Jews saying about Christianity? Well, many of these you can probably figure out on your own. First, a lot of Jews claimed that Christianity was simply a deviant form of Judaism, and that he had lost his way by going after Jesus as the Messiah. Christians, of course, responded by saying that the Jewish law was meant to be temporary, and that there were passages in their documents that pointed toward a new covenant. Right? So it wasn't a distorted form of Judaism. This is what God had always been working towards. Other things that Jews might say focused on Jesus and say, this humble carpenter that you follow is not the same as the promised Messiah talked about in let's call them the Hebrew Scriptures. That's not the Davidic king. Christians in response would say, well, when you look at those prophecies, they predict both the glory of the Messiah, but also the sufferings of the Messiah. Right? So you can't, just because he's a humble carpenter, you overlooking those passages and say he would also would suffer. The deity of Jesus that Christians claim, Jews would say, contradicts the idea of God being one. How can God be one if there is the Father and Jesus? To this, of course, Christians would point to passages in the Hebrew Scriptures that would say, here is some evidence of there being a plurality in God's unity. Right? Let us make man in our image would be one that people would go to, and others as well. And there appears to have been other first century BC and AD Jews who did talk about some sort of plurality in God, even though they wouldn't have said, like the term Trinity, let's say. In other ways, Christianity would point out the weaknesses of Judaism in a couple of different areas. First, they would argue that the prophecies that people were looking to in the Hebrew Scriptures were fulfilled in Christ. And so that he fulfills what they would call Old Testament prophecies, what we would call Old Testament prophecies. Secondly, the Hebrew Scriptures point to Christ. So not only does he fulfill prophecy, there were other passages that pointed to Jesus. And finally, in this second century, Christians would point to the destruction of Jerusalem as evidence of the completion of Judaism. And the temple was gone, the sacrifices were gone. This was God's expression of the end of the Jewish way of life as a religion. Question about any of those back and forth? Let's turn to paganism then. Some of these we've already talked about, but here we're kind of summarizing, bringing back together. One area that was just very problematic for a lot of pagans was the idea of resurrection. To the Greek mind, to the Roman mind, people did not come back to life. Yes, there was immortality of the soul, but the soul stayed in the underworld. And so there wasn't this idea of resurrection of the body. And the fact that Jesus was resurrected, was the height of ridiculousness. To which Christians would appeal to. There were eyewitnesses. There were people who saw Jesus after his death, who experienced him, who touched him, who felt that he was alive. Pagans might also point out that the God of Christianity, or this Jesus, was a criminal. He was executed. Why would you worship a criminal? To which, of course, Christians could respond, well, the trial that Jesus underwent was illegal. So already you have these situations of calling into question whether Jesus had legally been tried and convicted of a crime. A third attack would be on the novelty of Christianity. This is something new. Everyone knows that antiquity is important. Right? And so, while we want the next new gadget and the new development, the new car, something is true because it's old in this ancient world. Well, this is where, of course, you see the development of people saying, this has always been God's plan. And so even though Jesus comes along in this relatively recent period for them, it's always been planned. This is God's intention from the beginning. And then they kind of pointed out, right, so the idea was, well, the Jews had plagiarized the Greek philosophers, and so their response was, well, Moses existed before the philosophers. So if anybody plagiarized anybody, it was the philosophers who plagiarized Moses. Christians were not patriotic. They didn't participate in the ceremonies to honor the emperor. They didn't participate in the ceremonies to ensure the well-being of the city or the empire. To which Christians responded, we obey the law. We pay our taxes. We pray for the emperor. So we are good citizens in that sense. Yes, we won't worship the gods, but in all other ways we are supporting the empire. We talked about how pagans would make all sorts of claims that Christians were involved in a variety of immoral behaviors. Incest, cannibalism, etc. Christians would respond with, look at our lifestyles. And you hear these suspicions, these rumors about how we live, actually look at our lives. And they would point to how people would treat, we talked about the exposure of infants. You're the people that leave infants out on garbage piles. So do you really have the place to question our morality? But, the idea of just looking at our lifestyle. Christians are bringing about the destruction of society, said the pagans. You see all these things happening to the empire. It's enemies, natural disasters, all sorts of ways that the empire is declining at various times. To which the Christians responded, well, some of those natural disasters are God's judgment against your false worship. With the idea being that if you would turn from your false ways, God would stop that judgment. In return, Christians had some things to say about paganism. We've already talked about this idea that the philosophers stole from Moses. That does not seem to be the case. There does not seem to be clear evidence that such a thing happened. But that was one thing that they claimed, that the best ideas in Greek philosophy came from Hebrew thought. Polytheism, they argued, is philosophically absurd. It makes much more sense that there is but one God than there are multitudes of gods. Furthermore, Christians would point out the lack of morality in the religious aspects of Roman culture. We've talked about how the gods behaved, sacred prostitution at various temples. Look at your religion and look at the things that are done in your religion. This is a lot of immorality. The pagan philosophers, who you so well respect, they contradict each other. All right. So who's right? How can you tell, is Plato right, or is Aristotle right, or is Pythagoras right, or is Epicurus right, or is Zeno right? And sometimes they even contradict themselves. So how can you know, or how can you rely on these pagan philosophers in opposition to the unity found in Christian scriptures and Christian philosophy? Furthermore, they would argue that anything you can find within paganism that is true points to Christianity. And in fact, Christianity fulfills those things that pagan philosophers have been looking for. And so not just the things that the Hebrews, the Jews, had been looking for in the prophecies of the Messiah. The argument would also be that pagans were looking for Jesus. And here are the ways that Jesus fulfills things longed for in pagan philosophy. They would also appeal to the miracles, as we pointed out, as evidence of the truthfulness of it. They might also appeal to the fact that Christianity continues to spread despite there being continual obstacles in the way from the Jews, from Roman officials, from Roman society, from families. Yet Christianity continues to spread. It is true. And no matter what you throw up against it, it will continue to spread because it is true. And finally, they might point to the fact or make the claim that it is Christianity alone that meets the needs of human beings. And it's kind of a little bit of where Justin goes. Right? That I've looked through all of these philosophies. I couldn't find what I needed, but I found what I needed in Christianity, in Jesus. Questions or comments? All right, we'll go ahead and end there. Kind of a good conclusion. On Tuesday, we'll pick up with some doctrines of Christianity, specifically heretical doctrines, as things develop in the 2nd century that move away from the message of Jesus.